Good evening and welcome to the new Bugajski Hour from Washington, D.C. I would like to thank Voice of America for hosting the Washington episodes of my show for RTK. And today I will be discussing some key security questions with our special guest on the Bugajski Hot Seat, Ian Brzezinski, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council and Head of the Brzezinski Group in Washington. But first, my political commentary on a key international topic is entitled Moscow's Calendar of Subversion. In the coming year, Vladimir Putin's Kremlin will exploit the most promising opportunities to undermine Western cohesion. As Russia's economy declines and public disaffection mounts, Putin will seek new foreign escapades to demonstrate Europe's weaknesses while distracting his own citizens. A calendar of likely Kremlin subversion in Europe can help policy planners in Western capitals to monitor and counter the likely assaults. Above all, Moscow will seek to benefit from the Brexit fallout, the European parliamentary elections, and from perceptions of uncertainty over NATO's future. The repercussions of Brexit could prove damaging for European solidarity by shrinking the Union budget, encouraging other anti-EU movements, and postponing further enlargement. All such scenarios benefit Moscow as they weaken the European Union and expose its members to bilateral deals with the Kremlin. EU parliamentary elections in 27 states in May will also test the degree of disillusionment with the Union and help determine policy directions for the next 5 years. Populism, both of the rightist and leftist varieties, continues to grow in all corners of the continent and has become a compelling political factor supported by Moscow. Opinion polls project an assortment of right and left populists gaining 20% of the vote for the 705-member parliament. Such a triumph for Europopulism could halt further integration and multiply Moscow's opportunities to profit from the discord. It may weaken support for further sanctions against Russia's aggression in Ukraine and whittle down opposition to geopolitical energy projects such as Nord Stream 2. A third pan-European pressure point for Moscow is to disseminate uncertainty about NATO's future. This is assisted by comments attributed to President Donald Trump threatening a US withdrawal from the alliance, even though the US has increased its military presence along NATO's eastern flank. Kremlin propaganda seeks to convince Europeans that Washington will abandon them, and it is in their interest to forge closer relations with Russia. Kremlin policy is also geared towards more opportunities in key elections, such as in Ukraine and Moldova. 2019 also provides several exploitable weak spots in the Balkans. Moscow will offer to inject its own mediators and reduce the role of the US and NATO. The Kremlin profits from European division and uncertainty, but it will also face receding domestic returns on its foreign adventures if public skepticism increases in the midst of economic decline. Abraham Lincoln's purported saying that you cannot fool all the people all the time may eventually prove prescient, even in Russia. It is time now for the Bugajski Hot Seat with Ian Brzezinski, who is the Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council here in Washington, D.C., and also head of the Brzezinski Group in Washington in the United States. Thank you for joining me on the show, Ian. Good to have you back.
Yeah, it's good to be back.
I want to focus our discussion today, obviously, on U.S. policy, but more, I'd say, even on the impact of the Trump administration, of Donald Trump administration, on transatlantic relations. 2 years, a little bit more than 2 years into the presidency, I think we can make some sort of assessment of what has been and what's to come. So let me start actually with a very basic question. Who actually makes foreign policy and security policy in this administration? Is it the president? Is it Congress? Is it the State Department? Or is it some combination of all the above? Because people are often confused. Who should they listen to? Who makes policy?
The primary driver of U.S. policy is the President of the United States. Mm-hmm. He has a constitutional authority to do that. He has a constitutional flexibility or room for maneuver to be the primary driver. But you can't just look at the President of the United States and say that is the sole source of U.S. foreign policy.
Right.
You have to look at Capitol Hill because they have control over the purse, and that's the institution that creates the laws in which U.S. foreign policy must be bound.
Yeah, that's been the case in all administrations. It's just with this administration, oftentimes the president would tweet something, but that policy isn't it's not necessarily policy. Is it an opinion? Is it a passing comment? Oftentimes it's not reflected in the policies that are applied.
Well, President Trump brings to U.S. foreign policy his impulsive character. He's a person who wants to be very much in charge. He wants to be seen in charge. And so, therefore, he goes out ahead of his own team, so to speak. But his foreign policy apparatus still has fundamental similarities with previous administrations. He has cabinet who serve on top of their different departments and bureaus. They respond to his priorities. They generate different approaches to serve those priorities. Sometimes they even advise him against his impulses. And through that process evolves, the foreign policy of President Trump.
How would you define it, the Trump doctrine, if there is such a thing? Is it, it's clearly not interventionist in the classic sense. It's also not isolationist in the classic. Is there a way of defining that policy, to put it into historical context?
Well, he characterizes very clearly America first, and he does it in Jacksonian terms, which brings sometimes a bit of a nativist feel to it, a desire to focus on American interests first, a desire to be not entangled excessively in the complexities of the outside world, a positive predilection against getting tied down into long enduring wars. No one likes those. But it's juxtaposed and struggles with the realities of a world that's become increasingly globalized, increasingly interconnected politically, militarily, economically. And that is driving, that is collision between his instincts and the realities of the international world.
So it's not like the interwar period where America could afford to be, to some degree, more isolationist, more, let's say, detached from the world. It's impossible now, presumably, for America, particularly with all its global interests, to detach itself.
Yeah, our trade ties are a far bigger part of our economy. Our immediate security is affected by events around the world. Our economy is immediately affected by financial crises in Asia or in Europe in ways that didn't occur in the 1920s, in the 1930s, 1950s, even 60s and 70s. We're far more interconnected. Events happen much more fast, quicker, and on a more global scale.
And this catchphrase, America First, I think it was first used by Ronald Reagan, if I remember, during...
Actually, it has its roots into the interwar period in the 1930s.
Right, so right. But I'm thinking of the modern era. I think it was used by the Reagan campaign. But it has two potential meanings, doesn't it? It either means America alone or it means America leading the way.
I'm uncomfortable with the phrase America First. I think as a leader, you should always be concerning about not only your interests, but clearly benefiting the interests of others, and particularly your allies. In a negative way, it connotates that we only care about ourselves. But the administration, the president, many times has tried to demonstrate that America First means also our allies and partners.
And certainly his cabinet have...
his cabinet's underscored that too. But he too has personally said that.
Right. How would you then assess U.S. policy towards NATO under Trump? I mean, NATO is the key international security institution, organization, alliance, very much of concern in the Balkans, but also throughout Europe. How would you say Trump has affected NATO?
I always think of the Clint Eastwood movie, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, when I think about President Trump's policy and its impact on the transatlantic relationship. And I'll go from the negative to the positive. The ugly is the rhetoric. It's the personal attacks on President Trump's counterparts, be it Chancellor Merkel or Prime Minister Trudeau. It's a disparagement of the alliance, which he's called too many times obsolete. That's clearly ugly. It's his open questioning of the value of Article 5 and whether or not the United States should be standing up to those commitments. That's clearly ugly. It's unhelpful. It's divisive, and if it benefits anybody, it would be our enemies, those who want to undercut the alliance.
Right.
You know, one could argue that the bad in the policies is the tactics that he's been using to kind of force a more adequate burden sharing by our allies. Some could say it's overboard and somewhat divisive. But you also cannot ignore some of the positive things that President Trump and his administration has done. He's reversed the Obama-era withdrawal of U.S. forces from Europe. He's the one who decided to provide lethal assistance to Ukraine, something the previous administration wouldn't do. Under his presidency, we've increased our force presence in Europe. We've increased the tempo of operations. We are moving towards a more large-scale, higher-intensity exercises. We have increased our force presence. Are today, in fact, negotiating with the Poles a more enhanced presence in Poland with some permanent dimension. These are all steps in the right direction and are a reflection of American commitment, not only congressional commitment, U.S. military commitment, but even the President's commitment to the security of NATO. And that is a net positive for the alliance.
I would say even Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, recently stated that Trump's pressure, if you like, some of his words, may have actually worked, been constructive. In other words, defense spending is up, or should be up, I think, by the end of next year by something like $100 billion amongst the allies. In other words, he, if not praising, at least he acknowledged that Trump's pressure may have had some positive impact.
And that's a positive thing. I mean, when the Europeans whine about President Trump's complaints on burden sharing, it really is hypocritical. They're the ones who created this dynamic. We wouldn't be having this issue if they hadn't been so lax on meeting their standards, their own commitments to spending on defense. And it's more than just spending. It's also, you know, reanimating the warfighting culture necessary for the alliance to be an effective deterrent. Readiness levels in too many of our allies are way below what is necessary to effectively deter an adversary like Russia.
It's not just the 2%, obviously. Only 5 countries currently meet that threshold, 2% of GDP. But it's also the way that money is spent. Is it spent on education for civil servants in the defense ministry, or is it spent actually on equipment, on capabilities?
And exercises, including large-scale exercises that demonstrate that we're ready for whatever contingency our adversaries might want to try against us.
So do you think at his core, despite of his let's say, his tactics, his attacks, as you said, on certain leaders, do you think at his core Trump believes in NATO as the most important alliance in history that serves American interests?
You know, he's a businessman, so all he has to do is basically look at the stat sheet, so to speak, and he'll see that the alliance is a net gain for the United States. For a relatively small percentage of our defense budget, we get immense returns. For example, look at the Afghanistan operation. At the height of NATO's presence in the alliance, there were 40,000 Europeans in Afghanistan. That's essentially 120,000 Americans who didn't have to serve, because you always have the unit that's in the field, the units that just got out of the field and is resting, and the unit that is training up. So for this small percentage, less than a percentage of our defense budget annually in terms of what we contribute to the NATO common budget, we're getting at one time we got 100,000 Europeans that served instead of Americans in Afghanistan.
And the same in Iraq, even though it wasn't a NATO mission.
That's correct.
In terms of particularly Polish, Georgian, and so on, particularly
NATO
British.
is a force multiplier, and I think the President fundamentally recognizes that.
What impact do you think the resignation of Defense Secretary James Mattis earlier this year will have on U.S. security policy, military policy?
It's hard to say. You know, we're only weeks into the period following his resignation. I think it will ultimately be determined by whom he is replaced with, who fills his shoes over there. Those are big shoes to fill.
Sure.
He brought a tremendous amount of assurance to our allies and confidence. He was representative of America's commitment to our allies, but he was also very hard-charging. I mean, he was very aggressive in terms of pushing the allies to not only spend more, but also to step up the exercises and other things that need to be done to increase the readiness of our allies and their readiness to work with the United States, not just in Europe, but elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. So do you expect, I mean, as a temporary Secretary of Defense, do you expect to be consensus on the next appointment? Because Congress itself seems to be very much, at least the majority, very much transatlanticist, very much committed to NATO. And that's across party lines. I think it's actually one of the few things that is a non-partisan issue, that commitment to NATO. Do you think that will continue?
Oh, in Congress, absolutely. I mean, I've been really surprised at the level of interest and commitment that we see on Capitol Hill. I think it's unprecedented in the 30 years I've been working on NATO issues in Washington, including on the Hill. You know, today I think 70% of Americans, when they're polled, say NATO is important. You saw during the course of the last summit that when Trump was criticizing the alliance, Capitol Hill was passing with near unanimous consent, both on the House and the Senate, resolutions in real time, underscoring at least that institution's commitment to the alliance. And that's important because that actually buttresses the administration's support for the alliance, and I think helps prevent some of Trump's unfortunate rhetoric to kind of roll out of control and to be operationalized.
So his rhetoric, despite a pretty, let's say, core base of supporters that he has, 30, 35, up to 40%, despite his rhetoric against NATO, support for NATO amongst the American public has actually stayed at a very high level.
Not only stayed, it has increased over the last couple of years. And my understanding that even among quote-unquote Trump's base, support for NATO is fairly high.
Maybe also among some of the more left Democrats who are maybe more lukewarm on NATO. Well, their support for NATO is now solidified because of the Russian attack on our democracy.
And the question is, how much is that driven by their desire to be juxtaposed against Trump?
Exactly.
But on Capitol Hill, you have very firm, in some ways almost unprecedented support for the alliance.
Turning now again to some of the domestic questions, we're right in the middle, if not near the end, of the Robert Mueller special counsel investigation on Russian interference in our elections, and the potential of collaboration between Russian intelligence services and the Trump campaign. What impact will this have, do you think, on U.S. policy, and what impact has it had already on U.S. policy?
Well, you know, it's again, it's hard to say because we don't know what's going to come out of that report. Looking forward, we have entered in an environment where the Republican Party has lost control of one of the major chambers. We just recently saw a big showdown between the House leadership, led by Nancy Pelosi, and President Trump, the government shutdown, longest shutdown in history, and what appears to be a fairly decisive political win for Nancy Pelosi. So that has kind of left the administration a little bit on the back of its heels. And looking forward, one can anticipate probably a pretty aggressive seasons of investigations and hearings led by the Democrats against President Trump. And then, of course, you have the shadow of the Mueller report hanging out there. If the Mueller report comes out with something extremely, extremely negative, it's very possible the president will find himself pushed back into a corner. In that case, he'll probably turn more and more to his base and maybe feel politically incentivized to kind of act more on some of his impulses that you saw during the campaign of 2016. That could lead to, you know, stronger language on burden sharing and actions on burden sharing. It could be an animation of his desire to bring forces home, and we're seeing signs of that with his actions on Syria and Afghanistan. Kind of desire to kind of really animate the Jacksonian philosophy that kind of permeates his outlook on the world and the role that America should play in that increasingly volatile, dangerous world.
Right. On the other hand, though, he can't, if the Mueller probe indeed indicates that there is some, let's say, collaboration, collusion, as it's being called, the president can't appear to be weaker on Russia, because that would feed into that supposition that there was deeper collaboration, a conspiracy even with Moscow. In other words, I'm thinking of things like sanctions, which is, you know, the economic and financial sanctions on Russian oligarchs and Russian companies that Putin has been very much concerned to try and get lifted.
Well, Janusz, you know, on Russia, my personal view is that we're not leveraging the full potential of the West's economic power against Russia to kind of force it to curb its revanchist ambitions, to force it out of Ukraine, out of Georgia. I mean, here in the United States, we have roughly a $17 trillion economy. The EU has roughly a $17 trillion economy. That's $34 trillion up against the Russian economy, which is somewhere between $1 and $2 trillion, and probably getting weaker and weaker as time goes on. It's amazing to me that we're not able to exercise more leverage.
Right.
Both administrations, Republican and Democratic administrations, have not leveraged that weight that we have. So the sanctions that we have largely been pinprick sanctions. They've not been sectoral sanctions. They've been targeted against individuals, oligarchs, heads of intelligence agencies, and occasionally some companies, such as arms exporters in Russia, to whom we buy nothing from. I think it's been completely inadequate. With that said, when one criticizes the Trump administration for being weak on Russia, one has to recognize that this administration has been tougher on Russia than his predecessors. They've increased the number of sanctions, pinprick sanctions that they might be, but there are more of them, more spread across the spectrum than the previous administration. And they've hit him for the invasion of Ukraine. They've hit him for the social media attacks. They've hit him for human rights. This is an administration that is taking Russia to task for its violations of treaties, including the INF Treaty. The previous administration didn't want to do that. This is an administration that has increased our force presence in Central Europe. Right. And this is the only administration that I know of since World War II has used military force against the Russians. President Trump
of Syria,
actually authorized and our forces executed an operation against Russians in Syria that led to 200, 300 Russian soldiers being killed. That is not an act of passivity or cooperation with Putin. So while this administration's policy towards Russia may be imperfect, it certainly has been stronger than his predecessors.
There have been some complaints recently that some of the sanctions and companies linked with Oleg Deripaska, one of Putin's main oligarchs, who's also heavily involved in the Balkans, in Montenegro, nearly bankrupted the Montenegrin state. And there's been a lot of criticism that our Treasury Secretary, that others in the administration have been a bit weak on Deripaska and maybe some of the other oligarchs.
And that criticism is completely justified. I can see no rationale for lifting these sanctions. If anything, we should be increasing these sanctions and moving away from these pinprick sanctions against individuals. I mean, think about it. You know, there's Deripaska, what's his wealth, $7–10 billion? So we're knocking $3 or $4 billion off. He's still got billions of dollars left in his coffers. So how badly is he suffering? Not much. In fact, he's probably wearing that as a red badge of courage in the halls of the Kremlin. We really have to move away from these individualized sanctions to sectoral sanctions so that we can really squeeze the Russian economy. That's how you turn the Russian people against Putin.
Except there's one individual that hasn't yet been sanctioned, but it's probably the richest man in Russia, and that's Putin himself. Do you think his bank accounts in Switzerland and other places we should go after?
Absolutely. I mean, he's the head of state. He's the one who's rampaging across Central Europe. He's the one who's contributing to this horrible crisis in Syria. There's no reason why he shouldn't pay a personal price for this.
Let me ask you a question about, again, I want to go back to Russia in a minute, but back to American foreign policy making. There's always been this debate between who actually has more war power. In other words, more power to engage in, dispatch troops abroad to engage in foreign wars. And I know the Senate periodically pushes back on too much executive power in this regard. Where do things stand now? Because there was this question of the troop withdrawal, for instance, from Syria, which Trump announced, and possibly a major drawdown from Afghanistan, which some members of Senate, and this is Republicans, not just Democrats, have been pushing back on. Where do things stand there?
Well, it stands where it's been for the last 34 years, a certain amount of grayness between what is the, quote-unquote, the authorities of the president to initiate military operations and that of clear constitutional prerogative of the Congress to declare war. And I think we're going to remain with this kind of gray zone between the two institutions for the foreseeable future. And actually, that may not be so bad, because in today's age, you need your president to be able to act with decision. Ultimately, the Congress can check him because they control the purse, and they control the legislative process. But for now, to answer your question, it's going to remain a little bit ambiguous. The president will have the authorities, and he probably deserves to have the authorities, warrants to have the authorities, to use military force when he feels it's in the interest of the United States.
Well, presumably the last thing you want if there's a major crisis is for a big debate, long drawn-out debate of what we should do. Somebody has to take a decision quickly.
Right. And ultimately, you would think that the president would say, you know, I don't want to start something that all of a sudden I'll have the rug pulled out from underneath me because I didn't have the full political support necessary for that action.
Another related question, again, back to Russia now. Arms race. Are we back in a new arms race? You know, the INF Treaty, the Intermediate and Nuclear Force Treaty has been, in effect, abandoned by both sides. Russia cheated. They deployed cruise missiles that they shouldn't have under the provisions of the treaty. We've now, the United States now has suspended its participation, given Russia, I think, another 6 months to comply. Putin said he's acting symmetrically by doing the same. Are we entering a new arms race, or are we already in it?
Again, it's hard to say because we don't know what's going to happen in the future. But just let's be clear. The United States didn't abandon the treaty. It is leaving a treaty that the Russians have been violating now for 6 years. For 6 years, the Russians have been violating this, and the U.S. government has had over 30 or 40 meetings which we've gone before them and said, hey, you're in violation of the treaty, please come back and fall into compliance. And the Russians have dismissed that. So to infer that the United States is a bit guilty for abandoning the treaty, I think is unfair.
It's putting the cart before the horse, actually. It's
Now, what we know is that the Russians are developing a new ground-launched intermediate-range missile. We know that it has already been deployed, and we know it is already going into production, which means that there are plans that the Russians have to deploy these systems somewhere. If I had a problem with the administration and his decision to kind of fall out of the treaty because of the Russian violations, is that it's not clear to me what our reaction, what our response is to this new emergent Russian military capability. How are we going to counter this capability? To what degree is this capability an actual threat? If it is a threat, are we going to step up our air and missile defenses? Are we going to counter it with ground-launched cruise missiles or ground-launched ballistic missiles? Are we going to do we have to use ground-launched versions? Can we increase our stocks of sea-launched and air-launched long-range strike capabilities?
In other words, what is the strategy to counter this threat?
To me, it's not clear that the administration has developed a plan by which to respond to this capability. Quite frankly, they haven't even really explained why this Russian breach of the treaty is an actual real threat. They need to explain that, and then explain also what the appropriate response to this emergent military capability is.
By not explaining that, though, you raise a very good point, that one hears this line among some commentators that Trump has given a gift to Putin by withdrawing from the treaty. I don't actually buy this. I think let's put it this way, if you look at the history, the last major arms race in the 1980s, the Soviets basically could not afford to keep pace with the United States and eventually came to the table under Reagan. So it wasn't the arms, let's put it this way, it wasn't the arms negotiations that brought détente in the end of the Soviet Union. It was the fact that the Soviets went bankrupt and couldn't compete with us. Could history repeat itself?
I think we're looking at trends like that. I mean, you see the standard of living in Russia is declining. Real wages are declining. The economy is at no growth. The demographics in Russia is bad. There's increasing tension between Moscow and the different oblasts, particularly the far east and the Caucasus. So Russia is steadily moving into a more turbulent period of its internal politics. It's a tougher time for its people. And I think it's only a matter of time when Russians start wondering whether or not the current government is really providing for their interest. The question is when, and then the question also is how will Putin government respond to this? It seems to be one of their knee-jerk reactions is to create external crises that distract the Russian public's attention, and you end up with situations like we have in Georgia and in Ukraine, and perhaps even for that matter in Syria.
So is an arms race necessarily a bad thing? We assume it is. If NATO is more effectively able to defend Europe as a result of countering the kind of missiles that Russia is developing, and if at the same time, as you say, Russia cannot afford to keep pace because it is increasingly bankrupt, at some point it may come either to a major compromise by Russia on arms placements in Europe, or actual collapse of Russia itself.
You know, you would hope that President Putin and his regime would recognize that they can't win an arms race. And just because the West has a capacity to win an arms race doesn't mean an arms race is good. An arms race comes with risks, because what it infers is that there will be a buildup of increasingly capable, increasingly lethal, increasingly fast-moving weaponry on two sides of a line. And that increases the prospect of inadvertent conflict with potentially catastrophic consequences.
One other question on, we mentioned this a little bit earlier, but just to follow up, Poland, as you know, has asked the United States to in place, basically to build a base. What kind of a base? You know, there are different kinds of bases, but to put in a division or maybe more American troops on a more permanent basis, to more effectively defend Poland in case of conflict further east or in direct conflict with Russia. What's your view of this? Is this administration ready for something like that?
Well, this administration right now is negotiating with the Poles for an enhanced U.S. presence in Poland. And while it hasn't been made public what's on the table, many people are anticipating that it will lead to an increase in U.S. rotational presence in Poland. That is, more forces going in for 9-month deployments. They call heel-to-toe deployments at a somewhat higher level, maybe 1,000 or more level. Today, they're anywhere between 4,000 and 6,000 U.S. military personnel in Poland on a rotational basis. So that might be augmented a little bit, and there might be an additional inclusion of some permanent facilities. So not like a Ramstein, but facilities that would facilitate, U.S. facilities that would facilitate these rotations. I think that would be a step in the right direction, particularly if it's complemented with what they call enablers like air and missile defense capacities, prepositioned stocks of munitions and maybe even heavy equipment, engineering, intelligence assets like drones and such, all of which would facilitate a more rapid and effective surge of forces into Poland and the Baltics in the event of a contingency.
And of course, construction of better infrastructure to get those forces moving.
That's really on the Poles to do. My personal preference, however, would be to actually put into Poland a U.S. brigade permanently stationed. If we return a brigade to Europe, I think going to Poland's a good place. It's where it's needed, because we need forces forward.
It's a brigade of about 5,000, 6,000, something like this?
A little bit less, so it's not huge. But a brigade is large enough to justify the kind of permanent installations and family support that go with that. Polish aspirations for a division, I think, were beyond what the United States has. But having a brigade-level presence in Poland would enhance the alliance's deterrence of its eastern frontier. And I really believe the Poles are good allies. And you could see that brigade actually being a force multiplier, in that it would develop relationships with Polish units who theoretically could also adopt the same operating procedures and same equipment, and together they could operate both in theater and out of theater. And that would be a net gain for the West. It would be a net gain for the United States. It would be a net gain for Poland, because it would make it more of a regional leader.
How would you answer those that say that would be too provocative vis-a-vis Russia?
Well, I mean, I can't imagine anything like that would even come close to the level of provocativeness of invading Ukraine or invading Georgia. I don't know of any allied forces that have been testing Russian sovereignty by penetrating its airspace and sea space. I don't think we're doing hybrid warfare operations against Russia. All things that Putin's undertaking regularly against the West. So taking a brigade, which, as you pointed out, is 4,000 or less personnel, and putting it in Poland is hardly threatening to Russia's Western military district, which has well over 100,000 combat-ready troops.
Which actually, you raise a good point here. One often hears about those that are critical of NATO that we're moving close to Russia's borders. What nobody points out, or those same people don't point out, is Russia has moved next to NATO's borders, military next to NATO's borders.
And it conducts very, very large-scale offensively oriented exercises.
Which directly geared directly to threatening the sovereignty of NATO countries.
Their very scenarios are offensive operations against the West.
Right. Let's turn a little bit to enlargement, and this affects obviously the Balkans. It looks now that with the great success in Skopje and Athens in terms of the political deals that have been struck, that North Macedonia is next in line, Republic of North Macedonia is next in line for NATO membership. How long will this process take? I know all the parliaments have got to ratify, but Stoltenberg has said the accession process has actually begun. What do you expect?
I think within a year. I think it would behoove the alliance to move quickly on this. I would anticipate, well, first of all, you have two very dynamic, tumultuous political situations, one in Macedonia, one in Greece. In both constituencies, there are elements that are unhappy with this new accord. This new accord is imperfect. I can understand why some are uncomfortable with it, but the net gain is to facilitate Macedonia's accession into NATO and the EU, and that is of strategic significance, if not historic importance. Because their political situations are a little bit dynamic, that leaves them a little bit more vulnerable to external interference. And here I'm talking about the Russians, who should be expected to try and do whatever they can to try and derail the secession process, both within Greece and in Macedonia. So the West should move, NATO allies should move while the iron is hot, and press forward through the secession process.
Well, the Greeks actually commendably have pushed through this vote in Parliament. They now look as though they're going to be the first country to vote the accession protocols for Macedonia. At the same time, they've also criticized they've expelled Russian diplomats.
Yes.
They've also criticized the Russian government in the last few days for interfering in Greece's internal affairs. This is quite unprecedented in what has traditionally been, if not an alliance, a close historical relationship. How do you see the Greek role here?
The Greek role, in this case, the Prime Minister has been very, very constructive. It took a certain amount of political courage to push against his political establishment to get this deal ratified by his parliament. And so I think that's very important, and that's why I think we ought to move and strike while the iron is hot.
What would be your message to those Macedonians, or North Macedonians, if you like, who did not either take part in the referendum or who are either against or skeptical about this name change? Why is it important for Macedonia to be in NATO?
If Macedonia is in NATO, it's a more complete member of Europe. It is part of the most important security institution. It's an institution that doesn't hear Macedonia's voice as loud as it should. Now it will have representatives seated at the table. Its prime minister and the head of state will attend NATO summits. They will have as much influence. They will have the same veto that the United States has, that Great Britain has, that Germany has in this important institution. And the same dynamic applies to the EU. It now can enter the EU. And with that will come a greater voice and also greater economic opportunity.
After North Macedonia, which country do you think would be next in line? There's still a few countries in the Balkans that clearly aspire to NATO membership. I'm thinking more of Bosnia-Herzegovina, thinking of Kosovo. Serbia, not at this point because of recent historical memories. Who would be next in line? I presume the spotlight will now be on Bosnia.
Spotlight will be on Bosnia, but I think really what their alliance needs to really focus on is sending a clear signal to actually Ukraine and Georgia. They're on the front line.
That was my next question, actually. Yeah.
Their sovereignty is being directly challenged. both of them have been good transatlantic partners. They've been sending forces to NATO operations over the last two and a half decades. Their sovereignty and their security is critical to peace in Europe, and I would argue also to Russia's own development as an international actor. As the argument goes that a vulnerable Ukraine, a weak Ukraine, and the same applies to Georgia to a certain degree, creates a vacuum that invites aggression, and that aggression coming from a Russia that has an imperial mindset. If you deny Russia that opportunity, that imperial mindset has greater prospect of dissipating. Because as long as Russia has an imperial mindset, it will never really be capable of transitioning into a full democracy. And that's the kind of Russia that I think we want to have a constructive can have a constructive relationship with in the future.
Should they be invited into the alliance, Georgia and Ukraine?
I think they should be put onto a track that makes clear
the map process,
they're making progress towards the alliance. The alliance technically says one day, and there's a 2008 Bucharest Summit declaration, though, one day these countries will be in the alliance. But to me, they've met the democratic criteria. They are their military forces are increasingly capable, unfortunately due to live operations that they have to undertake to defend themselves.
They've had more direct experience of war fighting than most West Europeans.
Exactly.
Right? Also, public opinion. One of the constraints before in Ukraine was that public opinion in support of NATO membership was low. That has now soared as a result of the Russian invasion. Georgia has always been very high. So that is an important criteria for commitment of that country and the public to NATO.
Yeah, it's a consequence of Putin's aggression. It's a consequence of these populations here. I'm talking primarily about the Ukrainian population becoming acquainted with NATO. They've been through several years now of regular NATO exercises on their territory. They're beginning to understand the value of the transatlantic alliance.
Where do things stand on this territorial question on accession? In other words, one of the criteria being that you have a monopoly over the use of force on your territory. In other words, you control your borders. One of the reasons I think Russia has swallowed up bits of Georgia and bits of Ukraine is to help disqualify both countries from acceding to NATO. Would NATO ever accept a country, part of whose territory is occupied by another power?
It should. I mean, because by following, the alliance has allowed itself to fall into essentially Putin's trap. So Putin, through aggression, has basically stopped what is an important process toward the vision of a Europe that's whole, free, undivided, and secure. If a country has part of its territory occupied by another country, that shouldn't preclude it from NATO membership. The criteria for membership should be its commitment to democratic principles, its economic robustness, and its military capability.
Right.
If it meets those, I would argue the fact that part of its territory is being occupied by an aggressor state actually increases the need to bring that country into the alliance.
I would agree with you 100%. Let's talk, I mean, we're talking about territory, so let's go on to the question of potential land swaps in the Balkans. I don't know how much you've paid attention to this, but there has been a lot of debate in recent months of a territorial exchange between Kosovo and Serbia in particular. I mean, what do you think in principle? Is this a good idea if this resolves some questions, or is this a precedent that could have negative reverberations further afield?
It always depends on how it's done. I am fundamentally uncomfortable with drawing lines based on ethnicity or religion or culture, because we should be moving to a world where that kind of diversity is celebrated and appreciated. But there are always exceptions, and if there is an agreement that can be found in which local populations are satisfied, then it might be something worth considering. But off the top of my head, as a fundamental principle, it's something I try to avoid, and I think the world should try to avoid.
Has there been, though, a major change in American policy? Because there used to be this red line, particularly in the Balkans. No territorial changes. We abide by the administrative borders that were inherited from former Yugoslavia. Okay, these countries became independent, but we're not going to change borders between them, and we're also not going to allow for the absorption of any part of that territory by a neighboring country. I mean, has American policy changed, do you think, in the past few months on that red line?
I don't think fundamentally. I think there's a willingness to find a solution that can bring enduring peace to the region. And I would describe more of an open-mindedness rather than an abandonment of principles. Because fundamentally, the agreement has to be between two parties. And the question is this agreement going to be fair? And is it going to respect, fundamental principles of human rights, ethnic diversity, freedom of religion, a solution that doesn't animate or legitimate some of the worst dynamics that have brought conflict to this region and for that matter, to Europe as a whole.
There's one other potential negative, of course, is that Russia may try and use this as setting a precedent for its own appetite vis-à-vis Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, and other countries bordering.
You can bet Russia will try and exploit a principle like that. That's why we have to be very careful that any agreement doesn't animate or give legitimacy to such principles.
Let me go on to another major NATO ally, which has direct bearing on the Balkans as well as other neighboring regions, and that's Turkey. I mean, how do you assess U.S.-Turkish relations? Turkey has always been a key because of the size of its military, because of the basing that we have there, because of its strategic position, the regions that it neighbors. It's a major power, major population. How do you assess now? There have been a number of disputes between Washington and Ankara over this whole Fethullah Gulen extradition, over Syria, over the Kurds. Where do things stand?
I always start with the fundamental fact that when you look back at the decades that the United States and Turkey have been allies, Turkey has always been there with us. During the Cold War, it hosted our nuclear weapons. It was a front line against the Soviet Union. Right. It was firm. Even when we had different disagreements with them, even in Iraq, and I was in the Bush administration when we invaded Iraq, and there was great disappointment that we weren't able to use a northern front because the Turks didn't want to support that operation. But they still did what they could to kind of facilitate American military operations. The Turks have been very helpful to us in the counterterrorism realm. They're very, very tough on that. Yeah. And we have to remember that they have been victims of terrorism for decades. There are thousands of Turks who've been killed by the PKK. That's an ongoing conflict that they have.
That's the Kurdish Communist Party.
Now, with that said, under Erdogan, we've had a turn towards the worse in the bilateral relationship. The fact that they were, detaining an American citizen, a pastor, for unjustifiable reasons doesn't help and doesn't augur well for the relationship. We have different approaches to what's going on in Syria. We have different approaches to what's going on in Turkey's immediate south, in Iraq, and for that matter, Iran. Those have been, and those will continue to be differences that complicate the relationship. Erdogan's turn towards a more authoritarian bent doesn't help the relationship, nor does it help Turkey's relationship with the rest of Europe. So this relationship will continue to be extremely Byzantine, complicated, and dynamic. But our fundamental interests between Turkey and the United States remain fundamentally aligned.
Do you think another worrying factor is this Turkish-Russian relationship, which sometimes deteriorates, but oftentimes results in some sort of rapprochement where Russia stands to benefit? I'm thinking of the Black Sea, the Montreux Treaty, obviously, which I think benefits Russia because there's only a certain number of NATO ships that can enter the Black Sea and stay for any period of time. Also, Turkey has not taken a very, let's say, aggressive role against Russia for the occupation of Crimea, which, remember, was for longer under Ottoman rule than it was either under Ukrainian or Russian control. So are there things that Turkey could be doing more vis-à-vis Russia that it's not?
Yeah, I think Turkey's making a fundamental mistake in creating a dependency upon Russian oil and gas. I mean, they're facilitating the West, their own, dependence on Russian oil and gas through these pipelines. Yeah. I understand the rationale, but I think there are other sources of oil and gas immediately to Turkey's south, and for that matter also to the southwest, that they should be focused on. at least until we have a more normal relationship, a more constructive relationship with Russia.
And of course, relations, there's one country that's stuck in the middle of the Caucasus, relations in Turkey and Armenia have never been resolved.
And will probably take a long time before they fully normalize.
Except relations between Armenia and Russia are also being under question now since this sort of velvet revolution or partial revolution in Armenia in recent months. Very last question, a couple of questions, Ian, is US-EU relations. We've talked a lot about NATO, transatlanticism, importance of the alliance and so forth. But as you mentioned, the EU is an important transnational organization, both economically but also politically. Under Trump, let's say Trump has been very critical of the Union. He did openly support Brexit, regardless of the, let's say, the chaos we see now in Britain. But there are several other disputes over, climate change, over trade in particular. Where do you see that? How do you see that relationship developing?
This relationship between the United States and the EU under Trump has become quite rocky. But it's been more rhetorically rocky than in terms of actual action. So the sanctions the trade tariffs have been imposed, but they haven't been that devastating. They've been bearable. The unfortunate thing is that the rockiness of the relationship has contributed to broader global economic instability, and that has created negative dynamics that affect not only the EU but the United States. So it's a counterproductive strategy that Trump is imposing on the EU. When I think about the EU, I always remember a fundamental fact is that the reconciliation and peace we've seen in Europe today has not only been because of NATO, it's also been because of the EU. It was a main driver of reconciliation between Germany and France. It has been the glue that has kept the continent together. It has facilitated political reforms. It has been a driver of economic growth. There has been billions of euros of dollar equivalents that have been invested into Central Europe's architecture, infrastructure. It is a key element of a Europe that is wider, that is more democratic, that is more prosperous, and because it's more prosperous, it's able to invest what it does in the military and can do more, which it should do. And that military capability has been to the benefit of the United States. So I'm not among those who want to blow up the EU. There's room for improvement. Any large organization like that can lose touch with its populations, and I think we're seeing that today. But the question is not to eliminate the EU in a way that is driven by visions of sovereignty that no longer apply, or accusations of stripping of sovereignty that are clearly not justified. It's a matter of reforming the EU so it can more effectively serve its citizens, the countries that make up its community, and from our perspective, the transatlantic community.
I think some of the criticism of the EU has been driven by two major factors. After the economic crash, in other words, if the EU doesn't deliver economically anymore, what use is it, a lot of people think. But also this idea, particularly once Germany let in so many refugees, over 1 million refugees a few years ago, the idea that Europe is going to be swamped by alien cultures. I think these have driven a sort of populism and nationalism in the country. Do you see that danger increasing over the coming years?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, as the world becomes more connected, as people are able to communicate and move more readily, that's going to become more of a challenge. And the question is not whether to create walls, but how to accommodate and leverage diversity. And that's where the EU isn't getting as much traction. But it's ultimately not so much an EU decision as it is a national decision.
And as you mentioned, the EU is an important means for strengthening NATO as well. I mean, if EU resources can be spent on infrastructure, dual-use infrastructure that can help NATO mobility and so on, that's key.
Well, this is kind of something I've wondered about President Trump and his economic attack on the EU. When he imposes tariffs on the EU to weaken their economy, he's undercutting his his own objective to increase the amount of resources the Europeans committed to defense.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. So it's cutting off the branch you're sitting on, basically.
Exactly.
Ian, thank you very much. That was a good, wide-ranging discussion. I'm sure we'll have you back very soon. And thank you for joining me on the show. Best of luck in your work. Thank you. Unfortunately, we have already come to the end of today's show. I have greatly enjoyed being with you and with my colleagues at RTK and VOA. Good night, everyone. Stay healthy, be productive, and remain optimistic. See you all very soon. Miropavshim.